The long walk. The morning sun hung low in the sky, its light casting a golden sheen over the cracked sidewalks of the city. Clara Johnson, a proud woman in her 60s, trudged along the hot, uneven pavement. Sweat beaded her brow, trickling down her deeply lined face. But she pressed on, her aching feet and worn shoes bearing the burden of miles already traveled. Each step was a testament to her determination, a silent reminder of a lifetime of resilience. Clara's mission was simple yet urgent. She needed to deliver a care package to her friend, a widow who had fallen gravely ill. It wasn't just an errand, it was a promise. "We take care of our own," Clara often told her son, Malcolm, who'd grown up watching her fierce dedication to family and community. But the city had always been unkind to women like Clara. Its sprawling layout and segregation meant public transportation was both a necessity and a gamble. Today, her only choice was to reach the bus stop, miles from her home, and pray the ride would be uneventful. The bus stop. As Clara approached the bus stop, her legs trembled from exhaustion. She clutched the strap of her faded leather bag, its contents rattling softly: homemade soup in a mason jar, herbal teas, and a carefully folded quilt. Her breath came in short gasps, and she leaned against the metal pole marking the stop, silently willing the bus to arrive. The bus appeared in the distance, its rumbling engine a small relief. Clara adjusted her posture, pulling her back straight despite the ache in her spine. As it drew closer, her heart sank. Behind the wheel sat Rick Matthews, a man whose name was whispered with disdain in her neighborhood. Rick was notorious for his hostility toward black passengers. Clara had heard the stories, the slurs muttered under his breath, the way he made people wait longer at stops, and, worst of all, how he sometimes refused to let them board. But Clara, ever the optimist, clung to the hope that today would be different. She didn't have the strength for another walk. The bus screeched to a halt, and Clara stepped forward with as much dignity as her weary body could muster. The doors hissed open, revealing Rick's glowering face. His pale blue eyes narrowed as they landed on her. The confrontation. Rick didn't move to operate the ticket machine. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, arms crossed. "Where do you think you're going?" he drawled, his tone laced with mockery. "To the next stop," Clara replied evenly, her voice steady despite the lump forming in her throat. Rick chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "Not today, lady. This bus is full." Clara glanced past him into the near-empty vehicle. Only a handful of passengers sat inside, their faces turned away, unwilling to intervene. She met Rick's gaze, her eyes pleading but resolute. "Please," she said quietly. "I've walked a long way. I just need to get to Elm Street." Rick's smirk twisted into a sneer. "Not my problem. Maybe next time you'll learn to stay in your part of town." A murmur rippled through the bystanders gathered near the stop. Some shuffled awkwardly, others whispered among themselves. Clara turned to them, searching for a friendly face, someone who might step in, but no one did. Her voice rose, a note of desperation creeping in. "Sir, I'm not asking for charity. I'll pay my fare. Just let me on." Rick slammed a hand on the dashboard, startling her. "I said no," he barked. "Now move away before I call the cops." The assault. Clara's pride told her to walk away, to avoid escalating the situation. But her exhaustion and frustration bubbled over. "I have a right to be here," she said firmly, "and I have a right to ride this bus." Rick's face darkened. He stood abruptly, stepping off the bus and towering over her. "You people never know when to quit, do you?" he snarled. Before Clara could respond, Rick shoved her backward. She stumbled but didn't fall. A gasp erupted from the crowd. Emboldened, Rick shoved her again, harder this time, and she hit the ground, her bag spilling its contents onto the dirty pavement. "Stay down where you belong," Rick yelled, his voice echoing against the buildings. He kicked her bag, scattering the quilt and soup jar into the gutter. The crowd froze, paralyzed by fear and disbelief. A young woman pulled out her phone, recording the scene, but made no move to intervene. Clara struggled to sit up, clutching her arm, which throbbed from the fall. "You're nothing," Rick spat, looming over her. "You hear me? Nothing." The aftermath. Rick returned to his bus, slamming the doors shut as if to punctuate his dominance. He drove off, leaving Clara sprawled on the sidewalk. The crowd began to disperse, their murmurs fading into the background. A few kind souls approached her, helping her to her feet and gathering her belongings. One man, an older gentleman with kind eyes, placed a hand on her shoulder. "Ma'am, are you all right? Should we call someone?" Clara shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll be fine. Just let me be." She limped home, the pain in her body nothing compared to the ache in her heart. By the time she reached her modest house, Malcolm was waiting for her, his usual smile replaced by a look of concern. He rushed to her side, taking in her disheveled appearance and the bruises forming on her arms. "Ma," he said, his voice shaking. "What happened?" Clara hesitated, her pride warring with her anguish. But as Malcolm gently took her hand, she broke down, recounting the horrifying ordeal. His face hardened with each word, his jaw clenched in fury. "This isn't over," Malcolm said, his tone cold and determined. "That man is going to pay for what he did. I swear it." As Clara rested, Malcolm began making phone calls, his mind already formulating a plan. He wouldn't let Rick's actions go unanswered, not this time. Clara's pain would not be in vain. A day unlike any other. The day began like most others in Clara Johnson's life, quiet, purposeful, and steeped in resilience. At dawn, Clara prepared her care package for her friend, Miss Etta, who lived on the far side of the city. Etta had been a fixture in Clara's life for decades. A friend who'd once been like a sister, sharing joys, heartbreaks, and burdens. Etta's failing health weighed heavily on Clara's heart. This visit wasn't optional, it was an act of love. Her hands worked methodically as she folded a quilt, its fabric worn but rich with the history of her family. The quilt had been a gift from her late husband, a man whose absence still left an ache in her chest. She placed it carefully atop the mason jar of soup and herbal teas she'd brewed the night before. Clara knew Etta would appreciate the thoughtfulness, the care woven into every item. Clara glanced at the old clock ticking loudly in her modest kitchen. "Better get going," she muttered to herself, tying a scarf over her graying hair. She pulled on her shoes that had seen too many miles but still served her faithfully, and stepped out into the morning sun. The road ahead, the city seemed to stretch endlessly before Clara. Its sidewalks, cracked and uneven, told stories of neglect and division. As she walked, Clara passed through neighborhoods that spoke to the stark contrasts of wealth and privilege. In some areas, houses stood tall and proud, with freshly painted fences and manicured lawns. In others, the homes sagged under the weight of years, their windows boarded up and their yards overgrown. Clara kept her head high, though her body protested with every step. Her knees ached, her back throbbed, but she pressed on. With each mile, she rehearsed the conversation she'd have with Etta. She'd scold her friend gently for not taking better care of herself and remind her that she wasn't alone. She passed a small group of children playing in the street. Their laughter was a brief reprieve from her thoughts. A young girl waved at Clara, her face bright with curiosity. Clara smiled and waved back, the simple gesture lifting her spirits. But the city soon reminded her of its unforgiving nature. A car sped past her, its driver leaning out the window to shout something inaudible but unmistakably hostile. Clara flinched, gripping her bag tighter. She whispered a prayer under her breath, a habit she'd developed over years of facing the world's cruelties. The arrival at the bus stop. By the time Clara reached the bus stop, her legs felt like lead. She leaned against the metal pole, her breath coming in labored gasps. The stop was located on the edge of a bustling street, its surroundings a cacophony of honking horns, shouting vendors, and the hum of distant machinery. A few others waited alongside her, a young mother cradling a fussy toddler, an older man with a newspaper tucked under his arm, and a teenager absorbed in his phone. None of them acknowledged Clara, but she didn't mind. She was used to being invisible. The bus's rumble grew louder, and Clara straightened, her heart lifting slightly. She adjusted her scarf and brushed imaginary dust off her dress, wanting to appear composed despite her exhaustion. The bus rounded the corner, its dull paint peeling and its windows streaked with grime. Clara exhaled in relief. Soon, she thought, I'll be closer to Etta. As the bus screeched to a stop, her relief evaporated. Behind the wheel sat Rick Matthews, his face instantly recognizable. Clara's stomach tightened. She had heard of him. His reputation for cruelty was whispered among her community. Stories of his taunts, refusals, and outright hostility filled her mind. But Clara shook off her hesitation. She had no choice. She needed to board this bus. The tension builds. The doors opened with a mechanical hiss. And Rick's cold gaze landed on Clara. His lips curled into a smirk. A look of disdain that made her skin crawl. "Where to?" he asked. His voice dripping with mockery. "To Elm Street," Clara replied, her tone steady but polite. She reached into her bag for her fare. Rick leaned back in his seat, making no move to activate the fare machine. "You sure you belong on this bus?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Clara froze, her hand hovering over the coins in her palm. "I have my fare," she said firmly, holding it up as proof. Rick snorted. "It's not about the fare, lady. It's about knowing your place. And your place ain't here." The other passengers looked away, their faces a mix of discomfort and indifference. Clara's throat tightened, but she refused to back down. "I'm just trying to get to Elm Street," she said, her voice soft but resolute. Rick slammed his hand on the dashboard, startling everyone. "I said no," he barked. "Now get off my bus." The breaking point. The air grew thick with tension. Clara glanced at the other passengers, silently pleading for someone to intervene. But no one moved. The young mother clutched her child closer. The teenager kept his eyes glued to his phone. And the older man turned his back to the scene. "Please," Clara said, her voice trembling. "I've walked so far. I just need to get to Elm Street." Rick's smirk disappeared, replaced by a sneer of pure malice. "You deaf, old woman?" I said no. He rose from his seat and stepped off the bus, his boots thudding heavily on the pavement. He loomed over Clara, his face inches from hers. "Move," he snarled, "or I'll make you move." Clara stood her ground, though her knees threatened to give out. "I have every right to be here," she said, her voice firmer now, "and I will not be bullied." Rick's face twisted in anger. Without warning, he shoved her. Clara stumbled but managed to stay upright. The crowd at the stop gasped, but no one stepped forward. "You don't know when to quit, do you?" Rick spat. He shoved her again, harder this time. Clara fell, her bag spilling its contents onto the pavement. The mason jar shattered, its contents pooling at her feet. Rick laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "Stay down, where you belong." A witness to injustice. The scene played out in silence, save for the sound of a young woman's phone capturing the incident. Clara lay on the ground, her body aching and her pride in tatters. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She slowly pushed herself up, her hands trembling. A man from the crowd finally stepped forward, his voice tentative. "That's enough. Man, leave her alone." Rick turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "Mind your business, or you'll be next." The man hesitated, then stepped back, shaking his head. Rick climbed back onto the bus, slamming the doors shut. He drove off, leaving Clara to gather her belongings from the dirty pavement. The walk home. Clara's journey home felt twice as long as her journey to the bus stop. Every step was agony, her body bruised and battered. Strangers passed her by, some offering pitying looks, others avoiding her entirely. She wanted to cry, to scream, but she held her head high, even as the weight of the day pressed down on her. By the time she reached her front door, her son Malcolm was waiting, his tall frame silhouetted against the evening light. He rushed to her side, his eyes widening as he took in her disheveled appearance and the faint bruises on her arms. "Ma," he said, his voice low and trembling. "What happened?" Clara hesitated, her pride warring with her pain. But as Malcolm gently took her hand, she broke down, recounting every detail of the encounter. His face darkened with each word, his jaw tightening in fury. "This isn't over," Malcolm said, his voice cold and determined. "That man is going to pay for what he did. I swear it." And in that moment, Clara knew that her fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. Malcolm's resolve. The air in Malcolm Johnson's modest office was heavy with tension. The walls, lined with law books and certificates of achievement, bore silent testimony to his unwavering dedication to justice. But tonight, the man behind the desk was not just a lawyer, he was a son consumed by rage and grief. Malcolm sat, his hands clenched into fists as he replayed his mother's account of the attack. The bruises on her arms and the trembling in her voice haunted him. Clara was more than his mother, she was his anchor. The woman who had sacrificed everything to see him succeed. And now, someone had tried to strip her of her dignity. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a text from Danielle, one of his closest colleagues. "Saw the video. It's bad. Call me. Malcolm didn't need to ask what video she was referring to. News traveled fast, and by now, the clip of Rick Matthews assaulting Clara had likely spread far beyond their neighborhood. Malcolm picked up his phone and dialed Danielle. "What's our angle?" he asked without preamble. "Civil and criminal," Danielle replied. "We've got assault, a hate crime, and maybe even grounds for systemic discrimination. But you know how it is. This isn't going to be easy." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "I don't care how hard it is. This man has to pay." Gathering evidence. The following morning, Malcolm set to work. He began with the video footage, which had been posted online by a young woman at the bus stop. The shaky recording captured everything: Rick's sneer, his cruel words, and the violence that followed. It was raw, undeniable proof. Malcolm tracked down the woman, Sophia Carter, a college student with a knack for activism. When they met at a coffee shop, Sophia's eyes were filled with a mix of anger and guilt. "I should have done more," she admitted, her voice trembling. I didn't know what to do." "You did more than most," Malcolm reassured her. "That video is the first step toward justice." Sophia agreed to testify, and Malcolm left the meeting feeling a flicker of hope. But the road ahead was still fraught with challenges. He needed more witnesses, more evidence, and a strategy that could withstand the systemic bias they were sure to face. The legal battle begins. Malcolm filed both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit against Rick Matthews. The case quickly gained attention, dividing the city. On one side were those who demanded justice for Clara, seeing her as a symbol of resilience in the face of systemic racism. On the other were those who defended Rick, claiming his actions had been exaggerated or justified. The media descended like vultures, twisting the narrative to fit their agendas. Clara, a private woman by nature, found herself thrust into the spotlight. Reporters camped outside her home, shouting questions that ranged from supportive to invasive. "Mrs. Johnson, how does it feel to be the face of a civil rights movement?" one reporter asked. Clara, weary but unbroken, replied with quiet dignity, "I'm just a mother who wants what's right." Meanwhile, Malcolm faced his own challenges. The defense team, hired by the bus company, was ruthless. They dug into Clara's past, trying to discredit her character. They argued that Rick had acted out of self-defense, twisting the narrative to paint Clara as the aggressor. But Malcolm was ready. He countered every attack with precision, presenting evidence that painted an irrefutable picture of Rick's prejudice and violence. He introduced testimony from other passengers, bus drivers, and community members who attested to Rick's history of discriminatory behavior. Clara's strength. As the case progressed, Clara became more than a plaintiff. She became a beacon of hope for her community. Despite the stress of the trial, she made time to attend church meetings, visit neighbors, and speak with young activists who saw her as an inspiration. One evening, Malcolm found her sitting on the porch, a cup of tea in her hands. The moonlight softened the lines on her face, but her eyes were tired. "Ma," Malcolm said, sitting beside her, "are you sure you want to keep doing this? You don't owe anyone anything." Clara looked at him, her gaze steady. "This isn't just about me, Malcolm. It's about all the times I've seen people like us pushed down and told to stay there. If I don't stand up now, when will I?" Her words fueled Malcolm's resolve, reminding him why he had chosen this path. It wasn't just for Clara, it was for every person who had ever been silenced or overlooked. The courtroom drama. The trial was a spectacle. Reporters filled the gallery, their pens poised to capture every word. Clara took the stand on the first day, her voice unwavering as she recounted the events with painful clarity. "I begged him," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I begged him to let me on the bus. And he looked at me like I wasn't even human." The defense attempted to rattle her, asking invasive questions and implying that she had exaggerated the encounter. But Clara held her ground, her dignity intact. Malcolm followed with a series of witnesses. Sophia testified about the video she had taken, her voice steady despite the defense's attempts to undermine her credibility. Other passengers corroborated Clara's account, describing Rick's aggressive behavior. The most damning evidence came from the video itself. Played in court, it silenced even Rick's staunchest defenders. The footage showed everything: the words, the violence, the cruelty. It was undeniable. Rick took the stand on the final day, his demeanor defiant. He claimed he had been provoked, that he had acted out of frustration. But under Malcolm's cross-examination, His composure cracked. "So, Mr. Matthews," Malcolm said, pacing the courtroom, "you're asking us to believe that a 60-year-old woman, exhausted from walking miles, posed a threat to you?" Rick stammered, his bravado faltering. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of his guilt hanging heavy in the air. The turning point. As the trial drew to a close, Malcolm delivered a closing argument that would linger in the minds of everyone present. "This case isn't just about my mother," he said, his voice resonating with passion. "It's about a system that allows people like Rick Matthews to believe they can act without consequence. It's about every person who has ever been told they don't belong. My mother's fight is a fight for justice, for all of us." The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the courthouse palpable. When they returned, the verdict was clear: guilty. Rick Matthews was convicted of assault and a hate crime, a decision that sent ripples through the city. The aftermath. The trial's conclusion marked a turning point, not just for Clara and Malcolm but for their entire community. Rick was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, and the bus company implemented new policies to address discrimination. But for Clara, the victory was bittersweet. One evening, as she sat with Malcolm on the same porch where they had spoken weeks earlier, she reflected on the journey. "We won," Malcolm said, his tone triumphant. Clara nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "We did, but the fight isn't over." Her words hung in the air, a reminder that justice, while powerful, is only the beginning of change. The weight of the case. The morning after Malcolm filed the lawsuit, the first pangs of the battle ahead settled in his chest. It wasn't just another case, it was personal. Malcolm had fought for justice before, taking on companies and individuals who thought they were untouchable. But this was different. This time, his client was his mother, and the stakes felt insurmountably higher. In his office, he pored over case files, scribbling notes furiously on legal pads. He knew the defense team representing the bus company would be relentless. They'd use every legal loophole, every grain of bias in the system, to dismiss Clara's case. Malcolm could almost hear their arguments already: a misunderstanding, a harmless incident blown out of proportion. The woman provoked him. Danielle arrived with a stack of papers, her face grim but determined. "We've got a mountain to climb, Malcolm," she said, dropping the files onto his desk. "They've already filed for dismissal, claiming insufficient evidence." "Dismissal?" Malcolm scoffed, his temper flaring. "They have video proof, witnesses. How can they even try to claim insufficient evidence?" Danielle raised an eyebrow. "You know how this works. They'll try to muddy the waters, make it seem like the video is out of context or unreliable." "But we're ready." Malcolm clenched his jaw. "We'd better be, facing the public eye." By midday, the case had exploded into the public consciousness. News outlets seized on the video, playing it on repeat as pundits debated the implications. Clara's story resonated with some and enraged others, highlighting the city's deep divisions. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, their signs demanding justice. Some carried banners with Clara's face, her dignity and strength immortalized in bold strokes. Others came to support Rick, their voices dripping with defiance and denial. Justice for Rick. No to fake victimhood. Clara watched the news coverage from her living room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Malcolm stood behind her, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Do you think we can win?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. "We don't have a choice, Ma," he replied. "This isn't just about winning. It's about making them understand they can't keep getting away with this." Clara nodded, but her face betrayed her worry. "Be careful, Malcolm. People don't like it when you challenge their power. They'll come after you." "I'm not afraid of them," Malcolm said firmly, but deep down, he felt the weight of her warning. Uncovering Rick's past. Malcolm and Danielle worked tirelessly, digging into Rick Matthews' employment history. It didn't take long to find a pattern. Over the years, multiple complaints had been filed against Rick by passengers, claims of verbal abuse, erratic driving, and discriminatory behavior. Yet none had resulted in disciplinary action. One name stood out: James Carter, a former bus driver who had worked alongside Rick for years. Malcolm tracked him down to a small diner on the outskirts of town. James was hesitant at first, his hands fidgeting with his coffee cup. "Look," he said, his voice low, "I don't want trouble. I've got a family to think about." "I understand," Malcolm replied, "but this isn't just about you or my mother. This is about stopping Rick before he hurts anyone else." James sighed, leaning back in his chair. Rick's always been like that. He thinks he's better than everyone else. Especially black folks. I complained about him once. And you know what they told me? Mind my business. Would you testify? Malcolm asked. James hesitated, the fear in his eyes evident. If I do, they'll make sure I never work again. I'll protect you, Malcolm promised. You have my word. After a long pause, James nodded. All right, I'll do it. The defense strikes back. As the trial date approached, the defense team launched a brutal counterattack. They subpoenaed Clara's medical records, attempting to paint her as frail and confused. They questioned the validity of the video, suggesting it had been edited to make Rick look worse. They even dug into Malcolm's history, hoping to discredit him as an attorney. Malcolm was prepared for these tactics. But when the defense began harassing witnesses, his anger boiled over. Sophia, the college student who had recorded the video, called Malcolm in tears. They showed up at my apartment, she said, her voice shaking. They asked my neighbors about me. Made it sound like I'm some kind of troublemaker. I don't know if I can do this. You can, Malcolm said firmly. You've already done the hardest part by coming forward. Don't let them scare you into silence. Sophia hesitated but eventually agreed to continue. The incident only strengthened Malcolm's resolve. If they were resorting to intimidation, it meant they knew their case was weak. The courtroom showdown. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Reporters filled the gallery, their cameras clicking as Clara walked in, her back straight and her head held high. Malcolm walked beside her, his expression stoic but fierce. The prosecution opened with the video, the damning footage playing on a large screen for all to see. Gasps echoed through the courtroom as Rick's cruel words and violent actions played out. Clara kept her eyes on the screen, refusing to flinch, even as the memory of that day threatened to overwhelm her. When Clara took the stand, the room fell silent. She spoke with quiet dignity, recounting every detail of the encounter. I begged him, she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. I begged him to let me on the bus. And he looked at me like I wasn't even human. The defense tried to rattle her, suggesting she had misunderstood Rick's intentions. But Clara remained unshaken. I know what hate looks like, she said firmly, and that's what I saw in his eyes. The prosecution followed with a string of witnesses. James Carter testified about Rick's history of discriminatory behavior, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. Sophia recounted her experience at the bus stop, her testimony bolstered by the video she had recorded. Rick took the stand on the final day, his demeanor smug but defensive. He claimed he had been provoked, that Clara had caused a scene. But under Malcolm's cross-examination, his composure crumbled. So, Mr. Matthews, Malcolm said, pacing the courtroom, you're telling us that a 60-year-old woman, exhausted from walking miles, was such a threat to you that you felt justified in shoving her to the ground? Rick stammered, struggling to find an answer. The courtroom watched in silence as his guilt became glaringly obvious. The turning point. The prosecution's closing argument was a powerful indictment of not just Rick but the system that had enabled him. Malcolm's voice rang out, passionate and unyielding. This case isn't just about my mother, he said, his gaze sweeping across the jury. It's about every person who has been told they don't belong. Every person who has been silenced, dismissed, or dehumanized. We cannot let people like Rick Matthews continue to believe they can act without consequence. Today, we have a chance to say no more. The defense's closing argument fell flat, their attempts to paint Rick as a victim ringing hollow. The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the courthouse palpable. When they returned, the foreman stood, his voice clear. We find the defendant guilty. A moment of triumph. The verdict sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but her expression remained composed. Malcolm reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. Outside, supporters cheered as the news spread. For the first time in years, Clara felt a sense of vindication. But as she and Malcolm returned home that evening, she reminded him, this isn't just a victory for us. It's a victory for everyone who's ever been silenced. Malcolm nodded. And it's only the beginning, the fire of determination. The night after filing the case, Malcolm sat alone in his dimly lit office. The flickering desk lamp cast long shadows across the room as he reviewed his strategy. Every fiber of his being screamed for justice, not just for his mother but for everyone like her who had suffered in silence. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was personal. A reckoning long overdue. A knock on the door broke his concentration. It was Danielle, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee and a thick binder under her arm. "You look like you could use this," she said, setting the cup in front of him. "And I've got something you'll want to see." Malcolm opened the binder to find a detailed list of complaints against Rick Matthews. Over a dozen incidents, ranging from verbal harassment to borderline physical abuse, had been filed against him. Each report had mysteriously disappeared into the bureaucracy of the bus company. "This is gold," Malcolm said, his eyes narrowing. "They've been protecting him." "Exactly," Danielle replied. "The company's negligence could make them just as liable as Rick. If we play this right, we can hit them where it hurts." Clarice knew reality. As the days passed, Clara found herself in an unfamiliar spotlight. Reporters camped outside her home, their questions ranging from supportive to accusatory. "Mrs. Johnson, do you think this case will make a difference?" one asked, shoving a microphone toward her. "What would you say to people who think you're exaggerating the incident?" another pressed. Clara responded with quiet dignity. "This isn't about exaggeration or revenge. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring no one else has to endure what I did." Her words struck a chord with many. And soon, her community rallied behind her. Neighbors brought food and flowers, offering words of encouragement. Strangers stopped her on the street to thank her for her courage. But the support wasn't universal. One afternoon, as Clara walked to her local church, a car slowed down beside her. The driver, a man in his 30s, sneered out the window. "You should have stayed quiet, old lady," he spat. "No one cares about your sob story." The venom in his words shook Clara, but she refused to show it. She walked on, her head held high, her resolve unshaken. Still, when she reached the church, she couldn't help but wonder how much more hostility she would face before this was over. Uncovering the system. Malcolm's investigation led him to uncover a pattern of systemic failures within the bus company. Employees who spoke out against discrimination were silenced or let go. Complaints against drivers like Rick were either ignored or buried under piles of paperwork. It was a culture of complicity, and Malcolm knew exposing it would be key to winning the case. One day, he met with Linda Morales, a former HR representative for the bus company. Linda had quit years earlier, disillusioned by the company's refusal to address employee misconduct. "They didn't care," Linda said, her voice heavy with regret. "Every time I tried to escalate a complaint, I was told to drop it. When I pushed back, they pushed me out." "Would you testify?" Malcolm asked. Linda hesitated, glancing down at her hands. "I've got a family to think about. But I'll do it. People need to know the truth." Her testimony became a crucial piece of Malcolm's strategy. It wasn't just about Rick anymore, it was about holding an entire system accountable. The pressure mounts. As the trial date loomed, the defense team intensified their efforts to discredit Clara and Malcolm. They subpoenaed Clara's medical records, hoping to paint her as fragile and confused. They combed through Malcolm's past cases, looking for anything that could undermine his credibility. One evening, Malcolm received a call from Sophia, the college student who had filmed the incident. Her voice trembled with fear. "Someone's been following me," she said. "I think it's someone from the defense team." Malcolm's grip tightened on the phone. "They're trying to intimidate you," he said, "but don't let them. You're stronger than they think." Sophia agreed to stay the course. But the call left Malcolm seething. He knew the defense was playing dirty, but he hadn't expected them to go this far. Meanwhile, Clara faced her own battles. Late one night, she received an anonymous letter in the mail. The handwriting was scrawled and menacing. "Drop the case, or you'll regret it." Clara showed the letter to Malcolm, her hands trembling. "I won't back down," she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "But I need you to promise me something." "Anything, Ma," Malcolm said. "Promise me you'll be careful." She said, "This fight isn't worth losing you." The courtroom fireworks. The first day of the trial was a media spectacle. Cameras flashed as Clara and Malcolm entered the courthouse, their faces stoic but determined. Protesters filled the steps outside, their chants echoing in the crisp morning air. Inside, the prosecution wasted no time presenting the video of the assault. The courtroom fell silent as the footage played, each hateful word and violent act captured in stark detail. The jury watched intently, their expressions a mix of shock and anger. When Clara took the stand, The defense tried to rattle her. They asked invasive questions, implying that she had provoked Rick or misinterpreted his actions. But Clara's resolve never wavered. "I've lived through too much to let one man's hatred break me," she said, her voice steady. "I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know it was wrong." The prosecution followed with testimony from Sophia, Linda Morales, and James Carter. Each witness painted a damning picture of Rick's behavior and the company's negligence. But the real turning point came when Malcolm cross-examined Rick. The bus driver's bravado crumbled under Malcolm's relentless questioning. "So, Mr. Matthews," Malcolm said, pacing the courtroom, "you're telling us that a 60-year-old woman, exhausted and unarmed, was such a threat to you that you felt justified in shoving her to the ground?" Rick stammered, his face reddening. I didn't mean to hurt her." "But you did," Malcolm pressed. "And it wasn't the first time you've mistreated someone on your bus." "Was it?" Rick's silence spoke volumes. The verdict. After days of testimony and hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the judge sentenced Rick to a lengthy prison term for assault and hate crimes. Outside, supporters cheered as Clara and Malcolm emerged from the courthouse. Clara, though weary, allowed herself a small smile. For the first time in weeks, she felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lift. The aftermath. The trial's conclusion sparked broader discussions about systemic racism in public transportation. The bus company, facing immense public pressure, implemented sweeping reforms, including mandatory sensitivity training and stricter oversight of employee conduct. Clara returned to her quiet life, but she remained a symbol of strength and resilience in her community. One evening, as she sat on her porch, Malcolm joined her, a rare moment of peace between mother and son. "We did it, Ma," he said, his voice soft. Clara nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "We did, but the work isn't over." Her words hung in the air, a reminder that justice was not a destination but a journey the courtroom wait. The air in the courtroom was suffocating, heavy with anticipation. Clara sat quietly in the front row, her hands clasped tightly together. Malcolm was by her side, his expression calm but intense, the weight of the case etched into the lines of his face. Around them, the gallery buzzed with muted conversations. Supporters of Clara filled the benches on one side, their hopeful eyes fixed on the jury box. On the other side, Rick's sympathizers exchanged whispered comments, their faces a mix of defiance and apprehension. The jury had been deliberating for hours. Each passing minute felt like an eternity, stretching the tension tighter and tighter. Clara took a deep breath, her mind replaying the events of the trial, the testimony, the video, the moments when Rick's arrogance had faltered under Malcolm's relentless questioning. She had done all she could. Now, it was in the hands of 12 strangers. Malcolm leaned over, his voice low but steady. "Whatever happens, Ma, you've already won. You've stood up for yourself and for everyone who's ever been treated like less." Clara nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It's not just about me, Malcolm. It's about making sure no one else has to go through this." Before Malcolm could respond, the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." The verdict. The jury filed back into the courtroom, their expressions unreadable. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as the foreman handed a folded piece of paper to the judge. Judge Wilson, a stern but fair man, unfolded the paper and read it silently before nodding. "In the matter of the People versus Richard Matthews, on the charge of aggravated assault, we find the defendant guilty." A ripple of emotion swept through the room. Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes but blinked them away. Determined to remain composed, the foreman continued reading the charges, guilty on all counts, including hate crimes and abuse of authority. Each word was a blow to Rick's defense team, who sat stone-faced as the judge thanked the jury and dismissed them. When Judge Wilson pronounced the sentence, 10 years in prison with no possibility of parole, the room erupted. Clara's supporters cheered, their voices echoing off the walls, while Rick's side sat in stunned silence. Rick himself slumped in his chair, his bravado replaced by the hollow look of a man who finally understood the gravity of his actions. Clara turned to Malcolm, her eyes brimming with tears. He squeezed her hand and gave her a small, triumphant smile. "Justice, Ma, justice." Rick's downfall. Rick was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his head bowed, The once defiant bus driver, who had mocked and belittled Clara, now faced a future stripped of freedom and power. As he was led away, he caught sight of Clara. For a moment, their eyes met. His were filled with something unexpected, not anger or hatred, but shame. In the weeks following the trial, Rick's name became synonymous with disgrace. The bus company issued a public apology, distancing themselves from him and promising reforms to prevent future incidents. But the damage to their reputation was done. Local activists used the case as a rallying cry for broader changes, demanding accountability and equity in public services. Rick's family, once vocal in defending him, withdrew from public view. His wife filed for divorce, and his children refused to visit him in prison. Isolated and broken, Rick began to reflect on his actions. In the silence of his cell, the memories of that day haunted him, the cruelty in his voice, the hatred in his heart, and the pain he had caused. Clara's resilience. For Clara, life began to settle into a new rhythm. The trial had taken a toll on her, but it had also brought her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She became a quiet force in her community, attending meetings, mentoring young activists, and sharing her story with those who needed to hear it. One afternoon, Clara visited the local high school to speak at a student assembly. The auditorium was packed, the students eager to hear from the woman who had stood up against injustice. Clara stepped onto the stage, her presence commanding despite her small stature. "I'm not a hero," she began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I'm just a woman who had enough. Enough of the hate, the disrespect, the belief that some people are worth less than others. And I want you to know that you don't have to wait until you're my age to stand up for what's right. You have power now. Use it." Her words were met with thunderous applause. As she left the stage, several students approached her, their faces lit with admiration. "You're an inspiration, Mrs. Johnson," one young girl said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you for giving us hope." Malcolm's reflection. Malcolm's career took a turn after the case. Offers poured in from high-profile law firms and advocacy groups, but he turned most of them down, choosing instead to stay rooted in his community. He knew the fight for justice wasn't over, it was ongoing. And it required people who understood the struggles of those they represented. One evening, Malcolm sat on Clara's porch, the two of them enjoying the cool breeze. The neighborhood was quiet, the stars above twinkling in the dark sky. "You know," Malcolm said, breaking the silence, "this case changed me. I've always fought for justice. But this made it personal." Clara smiled, her eyes reflecting a mixture of pride and understanding. "Sometimes it takes something personal to wake us up to the bigger picture. I'm proud of you, Malcolm, not just for what you did for me, but for what you'll do for others." Rick's redemption. Months later, Malcolm received an unexpected letter. It was from Rick Matthews, written from his prison cell. Malcolm hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. The letter was short but sincere. "Mr. Johnson, I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I'm sorry for what I did to your mother and for the person I've been. Prison gives a man a lot of time to think, and I've had to face some hard truths about myself. Your mother didn't deserve what I did to her. No one does. I hope she can find it in her heart to forgive me one day, even if I don't deserve it. Sincerely, Rick Matthews." Malcolm showed the letter to Clara, unsure of how she would react. She read it silently, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and set it aside. "Forgiveness doesn't come easy," she said softly, "but maybe this is a start, for him and for me." A legacy of change. The impact of Clara's case rippled far beyond the courtroom. The bus company implemented mandatory sensitivity training for all employees, along with a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. Activists used the momentum to push for broader reforms, including affordable public transportation and more representation in city leadership. Clara's story inspired others to speak out, turning individual acts of courage into a collective movement. She became a symbol of quiet strength, her name spoken with reverence in her community and beyond. As the years passed, Clara continued her work, her voice steady and unwavering. And though she often spoke of the pain and challenges she had faced, she always ended her speeches with a message of hope. "Change isn't easy," she would say. "It takes courage, persistence, and sometimes a whole lot of heartbreak. But it's worth it." Because every step we take toward justice brings us closer to the world we want to leave for the next generation. The story of Clara Johnson and Malcolm was not just one of justice but of resilience, redemption, and the enduring power of community. It was a reminder that even in the face of hatred, love and determination could forge a path forward. And for those who dared to stand up and speak out, the world became a little brighter. One step at a time the verdict unfolds. The courtroom was so silent that the rustle of paper as the judge unfolded the jury's decision sounded deafening. Clara held her breath, gripping the edge of the wooden bench. She felt Malcolm's hand on hers, steady and grounding, as the foreman began to speak. In the case of aggravated assault against Mrs. Clara Johnson, we find the defendant, Richard Matthews, guilty. A collective exhale swept through Clara's side of the courtroom. But the foreman wasn't finished. On the hate crime charge, the word guilty rang out again, and then again for the charge of abuse of authority. By the time the last count was read, Clara's shoulders sagged with relief. The room buzzed with hushed whispers, emotions thick and palpable. Rick sat slumped in his chair, his once defiant expression now etched with disbelief. His attorney whispered something to him, but Rick didn't respond. He stared ahead, his face pale, as Judge Wilson began his sentencing remarks. This case is not only about the actions of one individual but also about the impact of those actions on an entire community. The judge said, "Mr. Matthews, your behavior was reprehensible. It reflected a deep-seated prejudice that has no place in our society. You used your position to humiliate, dehumanize, and harm another person. For that, you will serve 10 years in prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel struck the desk, signaling the end of the trial. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. But they were not tears of joy, they were tears of release, of letting go of the weight she had carried since that fateful day. The media frenzy. Outside the courthouse, chaos erupted as reporters swarmed to capture the reactions of the trial's key figures. Protesters holding signs for both sides clashed verbally, their arguments spilling into the streets. Police officers formed a barrier to keep the crowd in check. Clara and Malcolm stepped into the sunlight, their presence drawing a surge of attention. Microphones were thrust toward them, cameras clicking furiously. "Mrs. Johnson, how does it feel to hear the verdict?" one reporter asked. Clara paused, searching for the right words. "It feels necessary," she said finally. "Justice isn't about revenge, it's about accountability. And today, we held someone accountable," Malcolm added, his voice firm. "This verdict is a step in the right direction. But it's not the end. It's a reminder that there's still work to be done." Their words made headlines, but not everyone was pleased. Online forums lit up with vitriol, some calling the trial a witch hunt, while others celebrated it as a landmark victory for civil rights. Clara avoided the noise, focusing instead on the quiet satisfaction of standing her ground. Rick's new reality. In the stark confines of his prison cell, Rick Matthews sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the cold, gray walls. His bravado had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing sense of regret. He replayed the events of the trial in his mind, unable to escape the damning evidence that had sealed his fate. The other inmates viewed him with contempt. His reputation as a man who had attacked an elderly woman preceded him, and his first weeks in prison were fraught with tension. He kept to himself, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when necessary. One evening, during a quiet moment in the prison yard, Rick found himself approached by another inmate, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Jerome. Jerome, a former civil rights organizer, had heard about Rick's case. "You think you're a victim, don't you?" Jerome asked, his tone calm but piercing. Rick didn't respond, but his jaw tightened. "You're not," Jerome continued. "You're a man who let his hate define him. But hate's a choice, and you've got a lot of time in here to figure out why you made it." The words stuck with Rick, haunting him in the silence of his cell. He began to reflect on his life, the choices that had led him to this point, and the harm he had caused, not just to Clara but to countless others. Clara's journey forward. Clara's life after the trial was anything but quiet. She became a beacon of hope in her community, her story inspiring others to speak out against injustice. Invitations to speak at local schools, churches, and community events poured in. At first, she was hesitant, unsure if she had the strength to relive her ordeal over and over. But Malcolm encouraged her. "Your voice is powerful, Ma. He said, "People need to hear it." At one such event, Clara stood before a packed room of young activists. She shared her story not as a victim but as a survivor, emphasizing the importance of resilience and collective action. "We can't change the past," she said, her voice steady, "but we can decide what kind of future we want to build. And that starts with standing up, even when it's hard." Her words resonated deeply, sparking conversations and initiatives aimed at addressing systemic racism in the city. Clara's story became a catalyst for change, proof that one person's courage could ignite a movement. Malcolm's reflection. For Malcolm, the trial marked a turning point in his career. Offers from prestigious law firms rolled in, but he turned them down, choosing instead to remain in his community. He established a legal aid organization, providing resources and representation to marginalized individuals who couldn't afford high-powered attorneys. One evening, as he worked late in his office, Malcolm received a call from James Carter, the former bus driver who had testified against Rick. "I just wanted to say thank you," James said, "for giving me the courage to speak up. You've made a difference." "Man," Malcolm hung up, his chest swelling with pride. It was moments like these that reminded him why he had chosen this path. The fight for justice was far from over, but he was ready for whatever came next. Rick's redemption? Months after the trial, Malcolm received an unexpected letter. It was from Rick Matthews. The handwriting was rough, the words clumsy, but the tone was unmistakably sincere. "Dear Mr. Johnson, I don't know if you'll read this, but I need to say it anyway. I'm sorry, not just for what I did to your mother, but for the kind of man I was. I didn't realize how much hate I carried until I lost everything. Your mother didn't deserve what I did to her. I see that now. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope you'll believe that I'm trying to change." Malcolm shared the letter with Clara. She read it slowly, her face unreadable. "What do you think?" Malcolm asked. Clara set the letter down, her hands steady. "People can change," she said softly, "but forgiveness takes time. It doesn't mean forgetting, Malcolm. It means letting go of the anger so it doesn't own you." A community transformed. The impact of Clara's case rippled far beyond her neighborhood. The bus company implemented sweeping reforms, including mandatory anti-discrimination training and a more transparent complaints process. Activists used the momentum to push for broader changes in public policy, addressing issues like affordable housing and education inequality. Clara continued her advocacy, working quietly but effectively to support initiatives that uplifted her community. She became a mentor to young activists, sharing her wisdom and encouraging them to stay the course, even when the odds felt insurmountable. One afternoon, as she walked through the neighborhood, a young girl approached her, clutching a notebook. "Mrs. Johnson," she said shyly, "I want to be like you when I grow up." Clara knelt down, her smile warm and kind. "Don't be like me," she said. "Be better. Be braver, and never let anyone tell you that your voice doesn't matter." The enduring legacy. Years later, Clara's story was still told in classrooms, community centers, and courtrooms as a testament to the power of resilience and justice. Her fight wasn't just about holding one man accountable, it was about challenging an entire system and inspiring others to do the same. As Clara sat on her porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a deep sense of peace. The road had been long and painful, but it had been worth every step. In the quiet, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for her family, her community, and the strength that had carried her through. The world wasn't perfect, but it was better, and that, Clara knew, was a legacy worth leaving.